In a small village on the edge of a dense, misty forest, there was a legend of a sword, a weapon that was both beautiful and terrible, known as the Bloodspire blade. It was said to have been forged in the fires of an ancient curse, wielded by a powerful warrior whose name had long been forgotten. The sword was magnificent, a single-edged blade with a hilt inlaid with black onyx and silver runes that shimmered like ice. But the blade was also known for something else. Every wielder of the Bloodspire had met a tragic end, each more gruesome than the last. Few believed the story, brushing it off as a tale to keep children from wandering the forest. But to those who lived nearby, the legend held a chilling truth. People said that once you laid your hands on the sword, it would slowly claim your mind, twisting you with an insatiable thirst for violence. In time, it would turn on its master, using them until there was nothing left but madness and ruin. Elias was a hunter and a former soldier who had returned to the village after years on the battlefield. He had seen war, bloodshed, and things that haunted him every night. But when he heard the story of the Bloodspire blade, something stirred in him. Life in the village was peaceful, quiet. Too quiet. A darkness had lingered in his mind ever since the war ended, and he longed for something that could shake him from his haunted state. One misty morning, Elias made his way to the old hermit who was rumored to know the location of the blade. The hermit's cottage was deep in the forest, a place where even hunters rarely ventured. When Elias arrived, the old man was waiting for him as if he'd known Elias would come. "The Bloodspire isn't for the living," the hermit said in a voice that sounded like crumbling stone. "It drinks the souls of its masters, one drop at a time." Elias shook his head, unfazed. "I'm not afraid of legends. I've seen death, I know what it feels like. I can handle a blade." The hermit sighed, his eyes clouded with sadness. "Everyone thinks they're strong enough. Until they aren't." Still, the hermit reluctantly gave him directions to an ancient ruin deep in the heart of the forest. He warned Elias once more to turn back, but Elias ignored him, feeling a strange pull drawing him to the blade. It took him 2 days to find the ruins. They were hidden beneath a dense canopy, cloaked in fog, surrounded by trees that looked as though they had withered long ago. There, in a moss-covered stone pedestal, lay the Bloodspire blade. As Elias approached, he felt a cold wind slice through the air, but he didn't stop. He grasped the hilt, feeling a jolt run through him like a shock of lightning. The metal was icy to the touch, and as he held it, he felt a surge of energy unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The blade was lighter than he'd expected, perfectly balanced, as though it had been forged just for him. He marveled at the blackened metal, the glint of the runes, and felt an insatiable urge to test it. He swung it through the air, feeling it hum, and for a moment, a smile crept across his face. The blade felt like an extension of his body, a piece of him he'd been missing. But as he held it, he began to feel something strange, a faint whisper at the edge of his mind. It was nothing he could understand, just an eerie, persistent murmur. He shook it off, convincing himself it was the thrill of wielding such a legendary weapon. And so he made his way back to the village, the sword strapped to his side. At first, the changes were subtle. Elias felt stronger, his senses sharper. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war became less intense. He began to practice with the blade every day, marveling at the way it sliced through the air, its edge impossibly sharp. But as the days passed, he noticed something unsettling. When he looked at his reflection in the blade, his eyes seemed darker, almost hollow. He also began to hear the whisper more clearly. It was a voice, soft and seductive, urging him to test the blade's true power, to feel it cut through flesh, to see it drink in the life of another. Elias resisted at first, shaking off the dark urges, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, echoing in his mind even when he slept. One night, he awoke to find himself standing outside his home, the Bloodspire in his hand, its blade gleaming under the moonlight. He didn't remember leaving his bed or picking up the sword. His hands shook as he realized he'd lost control, even if only for a moment. Things escalated quickly after that. He found himself lashing out at friends, feeling surges of anger that he could barely contain. The voice in his mind had grown stronger, filling his thoughts with images of blood, of power, of battle. And then one evening he snapped. It started with an argument at the village tavern. A man Elias barely knew had brushed against him, spilling his drink. Elias felt a blinding rage surge through him, and before he knew it, he had drawn the Bloodspire, the blade flashing in the firelight. In one swift motion, he sliced through the man's shoulder, the blade sinking deep, almost as if it had a life of its own. He felt the weapon throb in his hand as if it were drinking in the man's life, his blood seeping into the dark metal and making it glow with a sickly crimson light. Elias staggered back horrified. But the voice in his head was ecstatic, whispering praises, filling him with an exhilaration he couldn't deny. The townspeople looked at him with terror, some fleeing, others frozen in shock. He tried to apologize but the words wouldn't come. The blade seemed to pulse with hunger, and he knew he had crossed a line. As the days turned to weeks, the bloodshed grew. Elias was no longer the man he had been. He would leave his home at night, driven by an insatiable urge to hunt, to kill. It was as if the blade demanded blood, feeding off his rage and sorrow, turning him into something monstrous. The villagers began to call him the ghost of black steel, for he moved like a shadow, striking down anyone who dared approach him. The forest became his hunting ground, and his presence cast a dark shadow over the village, a curse that hung heavy over the once peaceful town. One night, as he stood in the clearing where he had first found the blade, he heard the whisper again, louder than ever. It spoke not in fragments but in a full voice, ancient and powerful, telling him of the curse woven into the blade. The blood spire was a weapon forged by a sorcerer long ago, imbued with his hatred, his thirst for revenge. Every wielder who had taken up the blade had become his servant, his vessel. And now, Elias was nothing more than a pawn, a shell to carry the curse forward. Desperate, Elias tried to throw the blade away but his hand would not release it. The blade clung to him, its grip stronger than iron. In his reflection he no longer saw his own face but the face of a stranger, someone twisted and cruel, with eyes like smoldering coals. His last shred of humanity was slipping away. Realizing what he had become, Elias did the only thing he could think of. He drove the blade into the ground with all his strength, hoping to bury it, to contain its curse. But as he pushed he felt it pull back, resisting as if alive. The ground shook, and the earth seemed to writhe, rejecting the blade. With a final desperate cry, Elias drove the blade into his own chest. Pain exploded through him, his vision darkening, but in that moment he felt the voice scream, a piercing, anguished wail that echoed through his mind. He fell to his knees, feeling the curse lifting, peeling away like a shadow cast into the dawn. As his vision faded, he saw the blade lying next to him, gleaming in the moonlight, its dark surface smooth and unblemished, as though it had never tasted blood. And as his life ebbed away he heard a faint whisper, a promise, a curse renewed. The blood spire blade lay waiting, silent and still, for the next soul who would come to claim it, its thirst never sated, its curse eternal.